And just to avoid any more female advice, you gotta be able to get at it. So let's get moving.
So, a while ago I made a video about incompetent female writers in Hollywood, their responsibilities in terms of representing their gender realized by everyone but themselves, expressed my fears that sooner or later their undeniable lack of brains combined with their impressive level of commitment towards remaining completely passionless towards their very job that pays them millions was going to affect the perception of female filmmakers, movie lovers, their intelligence, abilities, interests, and morals in a very negative way in the future. Well, I was wrong. Apparently to some people at Disney, future was not soon enough. Cause baby, we're living out my worst nightmare. My worst nightmare being me feeling like I have to defend the very presence of my own hoo-ha if I want to come across as a creditable and brain-owning person when it comes to film. And all of this because of some privileged millionaire humanoid beings walking around in their $1,000,000 gowns, in their $1,000,000 mansions with singular agenda to perpetually embarrass me.
She's a powerful leader. Yes, yes.
Unfortunately, this discourse and the extent of its affected area has outgrown those very women themselves, since nowadays there are very many more additional facets to this conversation besides them being underqualified and incompetent. Even though before with the things like She-Hulk we were aimlessly teasing and shaking, now Pandora's box has been split wide open with a sledgehammer, and now there's chaos everywhere. There are women in Star Wars complaining that Star Wars is not feminine enough. I guess based on the statistical knowledge that Star Wars has predominantly male audience, behind the scenes, female producers are actively working to forcibly and artificially alter those statistics, intentionally or unintentionally eliminating a huge chunk of its male audience, which causes male fans to feel obviously offended and violated by this. And all of this births an unfortunate discussion on whether or not women belong in the context of Star Wars, inside or outside of it, which gives women in charge of the franchise a better basis to conclude that all men are toxic sexists who never want to see a woman thrive. Did I miss anything? I probably did. Let's go back to the beginning. After the costly acquisition of Star Wars in 2012, it was evident that Disney was highly focused on making the franchise not only succeed but outdo itself in terms of numbers. The path was clear. If they wanted to heighten its consumption, as most capitalist companies do, they needed to enlarge and diversify their consumer market that was strictly dominated by a singular demographic. That's a very logical standpoint from a business perspective. Star Wars never had a problem with attracting male audiences, so it only makes sense that they would mainly target and make themselves appealing to parts of the population that has not before expressed that much of an interest in the franchise otherwise.
We are trying to grow in the workforce a number of women in executive positions and in all positions inside the company, and with the movies that we're making and with the protagonists that we're putting in the stories.
And even though I do believe it was the initial strategy of Disney, something changed during its implementation. Maybe because the political pressure on Disney worsened, or Lucasfilm grew too comfortable and familiar with telling empty female stories just for the sake of it. Soon enough, the franchise started shamelessly prioritizing its abstract potential viewers and their interests over the actual audience and their wishes. From the get-go, the mere concept of fixing Star Wars was already a huge cause for alarm, and not because of the presence of females, but because it heavily suggested and established that Star Wars was flawed to begin with, disowning and insulting the entire fanbase's taste, intelligence, and morality. This is what initiated the foundational gap between the two genders when it comes to Star Wars, and it did, in fact, come from Lucasfilm itself, not from men, not from women, not from fans. And in hindsight, it was a complete rework of the very foundation of the franchise. Star Wars at its core has always been a family soap opera that in spare time dove deep into the philosophy of morality and timeless political concepts such as democracy and imperialism, things that are very much universal and unisex. Whereas now, through the rebrand, its core values have shifted onto the importance of girl bossery and representation of male nipples on modern screens. Their nauseatingly blatant political strategy to rewrite the history and verbally push Star Wars as something non-feminine.
Because I feel like Star Wars is very like patriarchal, so it was kind of cool to have like this sort of woman-centered figure.
Is itself responsible for creating the narrative that Disney itself is so adamantly swearing to be battling. The idea that Star Wars in its initial form is not made by women, nor was meant or made for women. Not only falling short when it comes to holding an intellectual discussion, but feeding into highly damaging and fabricated idea that Star Wars by nature has been at best unwelcoming and at worst particularly discriminatory against women. This, if not prompted, heavily fueled a very common and frustrating misreading of Star Wars as something dominantly masculine, made for male audiences. Some would argue that masculinity of it all is presented through Star Wars having swords and spaceships in it, but that is a highly superficial and damaging take on both masculinity and Star Wars that George Lucas himself would find personally insulting. Star Wars as it was in the 70s, 80s, or even 2000s, at its philosophical core was just as masculine as it was feminine.
There's nobody like Carrie. Very few women could carry off the particular kind of strength that she had. I did not want to put boys' clothes on a woman. I wanted a woman who's a woman, who was very strong and wise and a leader, and at the same time, young.
The core concepts introduced and explored in Star Wars are universally equally relatable to everyone invested in good storytelling. The hero's journey, the family dynamics, friendships, romance, politics, magic. Heck, the entire basis of the Skywalker saga is the tragic romance between the two main leads being way too passionate for its own good. How is that purely a masculine concept? Not to mention the fact that the original trilogy was heavily shaped by Marsha Lowe Lucas, an editor of all three original films. Some go as far as to argue that she was some kind of secret weapon of George Lucas at the time, and the sole reason why after their divorce, George Lucas's contributions to Star Wars never felt the same. Of course, these theories are far-fetched, but they correctly underline the impact this woman had on shaping Star Wars as we love it. But you will never hear feminists at Disney or Lucasfilm emphasize her name or her contributions, will you? Maybe it's because instead of competent female professionals, they only exclusively care for whatever and whoever panders and fits their intended narrative.
Young filmmakers, especially young women, ask me, if I want to become a filmmaker, what do I do? I'm always like, when that happens, say yes. Don't say, I don't know how to make a movie, because men don't say that. Dudes roll out of film school, throw on a Spielberg hat, and go, I know everything that I'm doing. And the reality is that you can do it. Like, you just have to have the confidence to walk in there and pretend like you know how to do it.
And emphasizing that Star Wars was built by a strong woman would discredit their fabricated historical record of being the most oppressed and disqualified members of the franchise. Also, maybe it's because they're threatened by Marsha's big set of balls, which ironically enough outsize the ones decorating her ex-husband.
I liked Kathleen. I always liked her. She was full of beans. She was really smart and really bright, really wonderful woman, and I liked her husband, Frank. I like them a lot. Now that she's running Lucasfilm and making movies, it seems to me that Kathy Kennedy and J.J. Abrams don't have a clue about Star Wars. They don't get it. And J.J. Abrams is writing these stories. When I saw the movie where they killed Han Solo, I was furious. I was furious when they killed Han Solo. Absolutely, positively, there was no rhyme or reason to it. I thought, you don't get the Jedi story. You don't get the magic of Star Wars. You're getting rid of Han Solo, and then at the end of the last one, The Last Jedi, they have Luke disintegrate. They killed Han Solo, they killed Luke Skywalker, and they don't have Princess Leia anymore. And they're spitting out movies every year, and they think it's important to appeal to women's audience, so now their main character is female, who's supposed to have Jedi powers, but we don't know where she got Jedi powers, or who she is. It sucks. The storylines are terrible. Just terrible. Awful. You can quote me, J.J. Abrams. Kathy Kennedy, talk to me.
The only actually innovative thing about this new feminine Star Wars is not that it's female-oriented, it's just that it's bad. And then there's Brad with $1 million question. If Star Wars was for women this whole time, why did women never watch it? Well, Brad, you're an idiot. And to answer that, Brad, is very simple and completely the reason why modern Star Wars is failing so bad with the rebrand of theirs, because the problem does not lie within the story of Star Wars. It never has. I didn't discover Star Wars until I was a teenager, and it was not because I actually watched Star Wars and deemed the story not feminine enough for me to relate to it, but because the society had pre-installed the notion and knowledge in my psyche from infancy that Star Wars is for boys. Therefore, every time I would scroll through the animated film catalog or search through DVDs, Clone Wars would always catch my eye, but I would skip on default right over to Disney Princess movie section because that's what I thought, and that's what I was taught I was supposed to enjoy. Of course, that worldview was shattered the moment I actually did give Star Wars a try, but unfortunate truth is, a lot of women never get to that particular part. So Disney's attempt at feminizing Star Wars was fundamentally flawed and ill-informed since it targeted the wrong problem. The solution was never within the story of Star Wars since it was never flawed to begin with, but outside of it. Again, the core concepts and values of the franchise have always been universal and timeless. The key towards inviting more women onto Star Wars bandwagon was in concentrating on breaking down the stigmas and taboos created by society towards Star Wars by constantly underestimating, understating, and watering it down to its most basic concepts. Through utilization of smart marketing practices, they could have warmed the society up to the idea that Star Wars is far more than just spaceships and lasers, attracting less masculine part of the general audiences to it. And the further popularization of the franchise by means of crafting overall great stories would cause more diverse audiences to naturally gravitate towards the product. And even if not, at the very least, the franchise would be able to retain its own initial fanbase. Hence, at the end of the day, correcting something that never needed correction in the first place caused a proportionally overblown, angered reaction that at times ends up misdirected. Oftentimes in nature, when there is a monumental and significant shift in the very prominent and significant area of many people's interest, it's only natural for it to spark an equally large reaction, the sheer momentum and weight of which oftentimes ends up miscalculated, and is very susceptible to being very easily misaimed, misinformed, uncontrollable, and the cause of a lot of unintended harm. It is highly impulsive, explosive, and unpredictable, and quite frequently ends up with consequences far worse than its own initial catalyst. This is usually how extremes and radicalism is born, in the shadow of which it is almost impossible to pin down objectivity. Disney initiated such a significant shift in the Star Wars franchise, initially pitched as a simple, harmless political adjustment to feminize the franchise. It inevitably and eventually started affecting the branding, altering the foundation, core values, and very basis of Star Wars, to the point where the franchise lost almost all of its identifying features. On the receiving side of it all, that prompted dissatisfied and discarded portions of the fandom to rightfully direct the immense scrutiny and criticism at the incompetent, corrupted leadership of Lucasfilm and Disney in general. As a further result, the conversation of look at what implementing femininity and female perspective did to Star Wars has become highly discussed and popularized within the fandom itself, which once again put a special emphasis on masculine versus feminine era of Star Wars, which is not only fitting into the fake and destructive narrative that Disney is trying to push, but also completely missing the mark and diverting the conversation from what's actually important, hence is making the whole discussion unproductive. The emasculation of Star Wars is of course the most obvious shift in modern products and an easy target for mad people, but targeting that as the root of all misfortunes is us basically willingly walking into an orchestrated trap designed by Disney. In reality, this emasculation thing is just a symptom of a bigger problem rather than its cause, because it takes both old and new Star Wars as a product at its face value. In reality, there is no masculine and feminine here. There was just Star Wars that was well written, and here is Star Wars that is not. There were great storytellers that cared for the story, and here are the ones who don't give a fuck. And also implying that Acolyte or any new Disney product is bad because of the female perspective is also highly insulting to the very very idea of femininity itself. Since, you know, The Way the Room is one of the worst and weirdest depictions of masculinity and male experience.
Anyway, how is your sex life?
As a woman, I can confirm that's how Acolyte is for the female experience. They're intentionally or unintentionally choosing to depict femininity in the worst, most annoying way imaginable, to the point that it doesn't even feel human, which I guess they are canonically alien, so... But the damage is done and irreversible. Now there is feminine Star Wars and there is a masculine Star Wars. There is Star Wars made for female audiences and Star Wars that was made for male audiences. This unfortunate set of events is a very fascinating and obvious manifestation of a very basic concept of overcorrection causes proportional overreaction, which served as an ultimate Pandora's box to make blatant sexism trendy again. I think the audience is an involuntary and unconsenting second side of the coin, on the flip side of which is Lucasfilm. I do believe that further down the line, this redundant situation is going to be equally damaging for both female and male factor when it comes to being a fan of, starring in, or making Star Wars. Don't get me wrong, as I've said, the passionate nature of the response to a flagrant provocation sometimes enables a very justified rage to be misfired and be targeted at the wrong side of things. It's hard to keep perspective when not only are you completely discarded by the franchise that only exists because of you and people like you, but also become a sole target of so much unsolicited hate and downright sexism from its leadership.
I like to make men uncomfortable. I enjoy making men uncomfortable.
When you have done nothing but support the franchise and own a dick. These critical people are not initiators nor the reason for this unfortunate discussion. They're just responders to an ultimate bait of the century, orchestrated by Hollywood and, by the looks of it, by women in Hollywood. Or is it? And here is the final boss of this video essay. Did women ruin Star Wars? This is going to be as quick as it is easy. How to explain this? Here is a picture of a woman we don't like and blame for shitty content. She is up in the ass of another woman we don't like and blame for shitty content, who is also up in the ass of a man we don't like and blame for shitty content. If women are ruining Star Wars, so are the countless faceless men behind the scenes who hire those women exclusively based on their genitals and not on competency. These are the same men who intentionally rigged their own system to work that way. Why? I don't know. And that is not some conspiracy theory at this point. It's a proven factual fact, unfortunately.
Certainly, there have been times where, there's no way we're hiring a white male person.
Just kind of unspoken.
There are times when it's spoken.
Corporations, corruption, and unintelligence does not come with gender attached to it. Believe me, at this point, I wish it was, because articulating this video would be so much easier. I could just point a finger to one or the other half of the human population and go actually study for finals. But here I am, writing this instead, while using the mere presence of two bothersome balls of fat on my chest as a conversation initiator. Cheers.